The Nazi concentration camps are and will always be remembered as one of the darkest and cruelest chapters in human history. Amidst this horror lie stories of resistance, struggle, and courage. Many women who were prisoners of the regime and survived inhumane conditions defied the greatest adversities and managed to tell their story. They have suffered firsthand the experiments of doctors, witnessed acts of extreme cruelty, and actively participated in desperate attempts at escape and rebellion. What atrocities were specifically inflicted on women in that hell? What hidden secrets reside in the shadows of the Nazi concentration camps? What stories of cruelty and courage remain untold? The hell hidden behind the walls of the concentration camps. When women arrived at concentration camps such as Auschwitz, Birkenau, or Majdanek, the brutality of the Nazi regime was evident from the outset. One of the main perpetrators of this structure of oppression was Karl Otto Koch, commandant of the Buchenwald and Majdanek camps. Koch exercised absolute control over the prisoners, imposing a regime of terror in which violence and fear were the most common tools. Men, women, and children were subjected to his authority without distinction, while a dynamic of systematic repression was reinforced. For the most part, deported women arrived at these camps under the false promise of resettlement or work. For many, this illusion represented an opportunity to escape the living conditions in the ghettos where poverty and segregation had reached unbearable levels. However, the fate that awaited them was very different. Etty Hillesum, a young Dutch Jewish woman, was one of the women who experienced this harsh reality firsthand. After being deported to Auschwitz, Hillesum described in her diary the humiliations she was subjected to from the moment she arrived at the camp. Like many other prisoners, her train journey was only the prelude to what would be a prolonged nightmare. Once they arrived at the camps, their arrival became even more sinister. The violence was immediate and manifested in the brutal separation of families. Women were torn from their children and husbands, and often this separation was permanent. Overseeing these separations fell to key figures such as Johann Schwarzhuber, deputy commandant at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Schwarzhuber was responsible for selecting the prisoners who, upon disembarking the trains, would be sent to forced labor or directly to the gas chambers. This cold and calculated selection process decided the life or death of thousands of people, including women and children, in a matter of seconds. Today, records of what daily terror was like in the concentration camps exist, thanks to testimonies like that of French activist Charlotte Delbo. This writer was married to Georges Dudac, and both were part of the resistance in Nazi-occupied France, where they worked as underground correspondents. They joined the group around the communist philosopher Georges Hippolyte and played an active role in the publication of the clandestine newspaper Lettres Françaises. On March 2, 1942, the German police managed to intercept one of the newspaper's shipments and arrested Charlotte and George in their apartment. Dudac was shot on May 23, 1942, after saying goodbye to his wife. After rotating through various detention centers, Delbo was deported to the Auschwitz concentration camp in January 1943, along with 229 other French women. This convoy was one of the few transfers of non-Jewish prisoners and became known as the Convoy of the 31,000. Also accompanying her on this trip were Charlotte Claude Vaillant-Couturier, a resistance photojournalist, and Hélène Solomon-Langevin, one of the first women to serve in the French Parliament. Charlotte avoided forced labor and the gas chambers because the convoy included non-Jewish intellectuals and scientists. This group, including Charlotte, stood out from the large crowd of communists and illiterate people of low incomes. Because they possessed some knowledge, they were selected to cultivate Kazakh dandelion, which was used to make gum. Thanks to this twist of fate, Delbo left a first-person account of what daily life was like in the concentration camps. She wrote about the terror she experienced at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück, which was captured in 3 books. In this trilogy, Charlotte managed to convey in detail the horror the prisoners faced, where punishment and death could arrive at any moment. Routine was marked by forced labor, designed to strip them of any humanity. The experience she endured firsthand in Birkenau and Ravensbrück was so traumatic that, at the end of the war, and upon learning that the Soviet Union used concentration camps, she abandoned her communist activism forever. The Beast and the Hyena, women in the service of Nazi terror. Part of the suffering experienced by women is due to the fact that the Nazis made no distinctions between genders or sexes. It was essential for them to subject women to a routine of physical and mental exhaustion. But the task of enslaving and torturing prisoners was not limited to men either. For example, at just 25 years old, Hildegard Neumann distinguished herself as the head warden at Ravensbrück. Due to her behavior and treatment of prisoners, she was promoted to Oberaufseherin at the Theresienstadt concentration camp. Being born in Czechoslovakia, Hilda viewed this transfer as a promotion, as it allowed her to be much closer to her family. As Oberaufseherin, she commanded 30 guards and more than 20,000 Jewish prisoners. According to records, she is believed to have participated in the deportation of more than 40,000 women to the Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen concentration camps, where most were ultimately murdered. Her task entailed supervising and guarding the prisoners during their long work hours inside the concentration camps and the Terezin ghetto. She is known to have easily allowed harassment and torture, as within her sphere were guards who went down in history for their cruelty and relish in the face of torture. Among them were Kylia Rojo, nicknamed the Terror of the Prisoners, and Hildegard Mender, also known as the Beast. Hildegard Neumann's whereabouts were never known again, only that she escaped from the camp in May 1945. Some sources claim she may have died on November 5, 2010, although there is no precise information. Due to the lack of information, she was never tried for war crimes. She is accused of being an accomplice in the deaths of more than 55,000 people who died at the Theresienstadt concentration camp. When it comes to inflicting torture, few women can compare to Irma Gräser, also known as the Hyena of Auschwitz or Beauty the Beast. Gräser enjoyed inflicting both physical and psychological torture. Some historians suggest that her behavior may have been related to her fanaticism for Nazi ideology. Irma's career began at a young age. At 18, she volunteered to enter the Ravensbrück camp, something her father had forbidden her to do, which ended with Irma being kicked out of her home. Irma reported her father, who ended up going to prison. In 1943, Irma entered the Auschwitz camp as a guard, and at the end of that same year rose to the position of supervisor. She was the second youngest woman to hold the highest rank within a concentration camp. At the age of 20, she oversaw more than 30,000 prisoners of Jewish origin. She was arrested in 1945 by British soldiers and tried at Nuremberg. Gress was known in the concentration camps for murdering her victims by setting dogs on them and for shooting inmates in cold blood. She was also accused of torturing children, sexually abusing inmates, and whipping prisoners to death. At 22, she was the youngest woman ever to be hanged under British law. She was executed on December 13, 1945, in Hamelin, Germany. Hell on Earth: medical experiments on women. In a Nazi concentration camp, physical suffering wasn't limited to the brutality of forced labor or inhumane living conditions. Many women, sometimes chosen arbitrarily or sometimes for certain specific traits, became victims of atrocious medical experiments. Doctors of the Third Reich, under the false pretense of seeking scientific answers, used these prisoners as laboratory rats to validate even the most twisted theories in the name of science. One of the most sinister places where these experiments were carried out was Auschwitz and Birkenau. Karl Klauberg, a gynecology specialist, was responsible for the most inhumane experiments recorded in the 20th century. In Block 10 of Auschwitz, Klauberg researched methods of mass sterilization, especially of young women. Between 1942 and 1945, thousands of women were injected with chemicals that caused severe inflammation, infections, and ultimately resulted in the prisoners' deaths. The objective was quite simple. The Nazi Party needed to find methods of extermination that went beyond the repressive apparatus. With these experiments, they sought to discover a quick and inexpensive method to sterilize women without surgery, eliminating the possibility of offspring from those considered unfit by Nazi ideology. Few women survived this type of torture, which left physical and emotional scars they carried for the rest of their lives. The women Klauberg injected with chemical supplements to sterilize carried an eternal psychological trauma, knowing they would never be able to bear children again. Mengele's name was widely known throughout the prisoner barracks, and even the mention of it made one's skin crawl. His team included Jewish prisoners with extensive medical experience, which quickly spread the word about what was happening in his laboratories. Miklos Niszli was a Hungarian doctor imprisoned at Auschwitz for his Jewish ancestry. He began working treating the sick and weak inside the barracks. His work was so extensive that with so few tools, Mengele himself asked him to become his assistant in the operating room. N4ZI is one of the people who managed to survive the concentration camp and recount the atrocities perpetrated by the Angel of Death in his experiments. In his book, Miklos describes in detail Mengele's fascination with cases of twins or people with physical abnormalities. With the goal of understanding the origin of these genetic characteristics and discovering the secret of cloning, Mengele carried out macabre and completely inhuman experiments. One of the most famous cases is that of the Ovitz family, specifically the Ovitz sisters. This Jewish family of Romanian origin was known for their dwarfism, but above all for being a Jewish family of artists. There were 10 members in total, 7 of them with achondroplasia, dwarfism, and 3 of average height. The Ovitz were deported to Auschwitz in 1944, and instead of being sent to the gas chamber for being unfit for forced labor, they were specifically selected by Mengele to take part in his macabre genetic studies. The Ovitz sisters were subjected to horrific experiments: spinal aspirations, bone marrow extractions, and eye tests, all of which were performed without any anesthesia. The goal of these tortures was to unravel the genetic causes of dwarfism. Beyond these torture sessions, the Ovitz sisters managed to survive the war, but the memories of the experiments haunted them forever. Their resilience is also a symbol and testament to how courage stands in the face of horror. But Auschwitz wasn't the only hell on earth. Ravensbrück was also the scene of terrible human atrocities. Under the direction of Karl Gebhardt, prisoners were subjected to surgical procedures without anesthesia. The goal was to test the effectiveness of different treatments for infections, as a trial method that could later be used in more extreme situations far from hospitals, such as on the battlefield. Many women had their wounds deliberately infected with bacteria, glass, or metal shards, just to see how their bodies would respond to the experimental treatments. Among the women who suffered these tests was Jadwiga Dzido, a young Polish woman subjected to various surgical experiments. Dzido's leg wound was intentionally infected with bacteria and contaminated soil, and various types of surgeries were then performed. During the Nuremberg trials, she herself showed the scars left by these tortures, testifying before the world about the atrocities she experienced at Ravensbrück. Women in resistance roles. Amid the horror and oppression of Nazi concentration camps, some women not only fought for their own survival but also played crucial roles in the resistance. Despite the inhumane conditions and daily brutality, these women became symbols of courage, ingenuity, and solidarity. Women in the concentration camps had to navigate not only the struggle for physical survival but also the complexity of resistance and everything it entailed. Such was the level of horror that it naturally generated in the prisoners the need to rise up against oppression and torture. At Auschwitz, some prisoners organized clandestine support networks, sharing information and resources. Elena Gorska, a young Polish prisoner, stood out for her role in organizing a spy network that helped prisoners obtain information about troop movements outside the camp and conditions inside. Through these networks, prisoners could communicate with the outside world and provide information to organize the various centers of resistance. Since many women worked as physicians' assistants, this network of espionage and smuggling within the camps was crucial to keeping as many people as possible alive. Many stole food and medicine when no one was looking, hid it in their clothes to avoid detection by guards, and delivered it to women in need. These small acts of resistance were a powerful way to confront the Nazi apparatus, even though they knew doing so would put their lives and those of their loved ones at risk. But the ultimate act of insubordination against the Germans was escaping from the concentration camp. Despite the enormous risks involved, some escape attempts involved brave women. This is the case of Marta Zimmerbaum, born in 1918 in Brzesko, Poland. She was captured in 1942 in Antwerp, Belgium, and taken by the Germans to the Auschwitz concentration camp. Fluent in several languages, Marta held a privileged position, working as an interpreter between prisoners and Nazi officials. Despite this privileged position, Marta decided to commit to the resistance, helping prisoners obtain food and medicine and saving herself from dangerous situations. In 1944, she decided to escape with her lover, Edward Galinski. Together, They planned their escape for June 24, 1944, taking advantage of the reduced security that occurred that weekend. They managed to escape from the camp using a Schutzstaffel uniform disguise and a blank pass, but were captured 2 weeks later on July 6 in the Beskids Mountains. After their capture, they were both sent to Birkenau to be publicly executed on September 15, 1944. The role of women and their links with the Sonda Commando. Within the Nazi death machine, there was a group of prisoners who, forced by the Germans, performed the most horrific tasks in the concentration camps. They were the Sonda Commando. Translated from German, it means Special Commando, and they were composed mostly of Jewish men. They were forced to work in the crematoriums and gas chambers, forming the main cog in the mass extermination process. The Sonda Commando operated in camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, and were responsible for removing bodies from the gas chambers, burning them in the crematoria, and disposing of the ashes. This task, imposed under threat of death, made them involuntary witnesses to the magnitude of the genocide. These men lived under the constant threat of death, and the lifespan of a Sonda Commando rarely exceeded 3 months, as they were executed after several months of work to prevent them from becoming dangerous witnesses. In fact, the first task of a Sonda Commando was to cremate and dispose of the ashes of the previous task force, making them direct witnesses of what would happen to them in a couple of months. Despite their terrible fate, the Sonda Commando enjoyed certain privileges within the camps compared to other prisoners. Knowing they would be executed after a short period of service, they received larger food rations and better living conditions than other Jews. This did not mean they did not live in a constant climate of fear, not knowing when they would be executed, and that every mistake in their service was punished with death. However, knowing their days were numbered, many chose not to take advantage of these extra rations for themselves. Some shared their food with other, less fortunate prisoners, mainly women, through clandestine networks within the camps. Although the Sonda Commando were predominantly men, their contact with female prisoners was much more frequent than might be expected in such a controlled environment. In camps like Auschwitz, the women's barracks were not far from the cremation grounds, and on occasion minimal interaction was achieved thanks to the resistance networks they forged within the camps. Despite the constant risk of death involved in participating in these actions, women and men in the Sonda Commando shared food, hid supplies, or coordinated small acts of sabotage. Rosa Robota, a young Polish Jew, is a clear example of this type of underground resistance that emerged under the eyes of Nazi guards. Robota worked in the clothing depot adjacent to Crematorium 3 in Birkenau. It was here that she recognized several people from her hometown who worked with the Sonda Commando group. It was precisely because she knew them beforehand that she was able to begin working with the resistance. Rosa Robota was not only a key player in this network of connections between the women's barracks and the Sonda Commando, but she was also part of one of the most interesting historical events in the concentration camps called the Sonda Commando Uprising at the Auschwitz crematoria. The Jewish uprisings and the role of women during World War II. During the Holocaust, Jewish uprisings and acts of active resistance were recorded in response to Nazi atrocities. These acts of courage occurred in diverse forms and places, demonstrating that, despite adverse conditions, there were attempts at resistance in the face of a seemingly inevitable fate. Although the dominant narrative in films, TV series, and books often emphasizes suffering and victimization, it is important to recognize these efforts of struggle and resistance. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which took place between August and October 1944, is considered one of the most important acts of Jewish resistance during World War II. In this case, women also played prominent roles as messengers and liaisons in planning the uprising. These women were known as kashariot, serving as liaisons between Jewish organizations within the ghetto and the resistance outside. Key figures in this role were Zivia Lubetkin and Tosia Altman, both prominent members of youth resistance organizations such as the Jewish Combat Organization and DRAW, a socialist Zionist group. Zivia is one of the most important leaders of the Jewish Combat Organization and one of the founders of the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance. Altman, for her part, was a key figure as she was responsible for coordinating and distributing the weapons that entered the ghetto. After the uprising, she was captured by the Nazis and died of the wounds she sustained while trying to escape. But women also took an active role in the uprisings, participating in the armed struggle. Frumka, Plotnica, and Miragola fought side by side with men in the streets of the ghetto, defending resistance positions against the Nazi forces. Although traditional historiography emphasizes male leadership in the uprising, many women played a key role in the fighting. Another of the most shocking uprisings of the Jewish resistance was that of October 7, 1944, at Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is considered the largest act of resistance within a Nazi camp. It was planned by various prisoners within the camp, with the Sonda Commando prisoners working in Crematorium 4 playing a fundamental role. After months of preparation and knowing their days were numbered, they decided they would not die without a fight. But for this uprising to happen, they needed extra help from the female prisoners. These women worked in a munitions factory inside the camp and risked their lives smuggling small quantities of gunpowder to the Sonda Commando prisoners. Among the brave women were Rosa Robota, Esther Weichblum, Ella Gertner, and Regina Saffirstein. They bravely managed to hide the gunpowder in their clothing and thus smuggle the raw material the Sonda Commando needed to make explosives to detonate in Crematorium 4. The objective of this was twofold. First, to blow up the crematorium, which, while not ending the mass extermination, temporarily reduced the camp's capacity for mass murder. Remember, the crematoriums and gas chambers operated around the clock, constantly operating to exterminate as many people as possible. The other objective was to create a diversion so they could seize as many weapons as possible from the Nazi guards, free as many prisoners as possible, and escape as far from the concentration camp as possible. The ultimate goal was to contact resistance fighters outside the concentration camps. Finally, on October 7, 1944, the gunpowder was converted into improvised grenades that the Sonda Commando managed to sneak into one of the crematorium chambers. The fire from the crematorium set off the explosives, blowing up the crematorium and destroying the adjacent gas chamber. This sparked the uprising, in which the Sonda Commando men fought with the few weapons they had, managing to kill several Nazi guards. However, despite the magnitude of the explosion and the organization, the resistance was quickly crushed by the German forces. The consequences of this act of resistance were swift. Rosa Robota, Esther Weichblum, and the other women were arrested shortly after the revolt. Despite being brutally tortured, none of them betrayed their comrades. They paid the highest price for their bravery. They were hanged on January 6, 1945, just a few weeks before the camp's liberation. Still, their sacrifice was not in vain. These acts of resistance showed the world that even in the most inhumane conditions, it is possible to fight in the name of dignity and justice. The Soibbor Uprising and the role of women. On October 14, 1943, in a corner of Nazi-occupied Poland, one of the most shocking acts of resistance of World War II took place, the Soibbor Uprising. Although much less well known than the Warsaw Ghetto or Auschwitz uprisings, Soibbor was not only a heroic act of the Jewish people, but also tells the story of brave women who risked everything to escape. Soibbor was a much smaller extermination camp compared to Auschwitz. For example, it is estimated that Auschwitz murdered over 1 million people, while the Nazis at Soibbor are estimated to have killed between 170,000 and 250,000 people. But Soibbor was created by the Third Reich solely to systematically murder people classified as enemies of the state. The Auschwitz-Birkenau complex was also an extermination center, but it also functioned as a concentration and forced labor camp. Soibbor was part of Operation Reinhard, the secret codename for the extermination of Polish Jews in occupied Poland. Its sole purpose was mass murder, not forced labor or prolonged confinement. Any transfer of a person to Soibbor as a prisoner was an immediate death sentence. However, on October 14, 1943, a group of prisoners achieved the impossible. They rebelled against the Nazis in an attempt to escape. The uprising was an act of desperation, but above all of resistance. It was planned by Soviet Jewish prisoners under the leadership of Alexander Pechersky. The prisoners quickly realized that Soibbor was not a labor camp, but an extermination center, and they needed to escape as quickly as possible. They knew their time was limited, and so they began organizing the rebellion. While the narrative of the Soibbor Uprising often focuses on men, women also played a pivotal role. Most of them acted as liaisons or messengers within the camp, helping to ensure the perfect coordination of the coup. One of the most significant women in this episode is Selma Engel, a young Dutch Jewish woman who had been deported to the extermination camp in April 1943. She was selected by the Nazis to work cleaning and organizing the clothing of those sent to the gas chambers. Among the items she was able to keep from the clothes, she found a small knife which was instrumental in stabbing a Nazi guard upon her escape, allowing her and several other prisoners to flee into the woods. She was protected by a Polish farming couple and, after the war ended, settled in the United States. She only returned to Europe to testify at the trials of war criminals for the atrocities committed at Soibbor. An estimated 300 people managed to escape from the Soibbor extermination camp, pursued by some 500 or 600 Schutzstaffel soldiers. Most were caught and killed in the nearby forests. After World War II, only 47 escapees survived, including 8 women. In fact, after the escape, the Nazis dismantled the camp and planted a forest there, so there would be no memory of what happened. If it weren't for the brave stories of women like Selma Engel, there would be no witnesses to the mass murder that took place there. Art and resistance, women who preserved memory. During the Holocaust, many women used their creativity as a form of expression and an act of resistance. Through painting, poetry, theater, and music, these artists sought not only to survive but also to preserve their memories and those of their communities, leaving an authentic and heartbreaking record of this dark period in history. For example, Java Rosenfarb, a Polish Jewish artist born in 1923, was noted for depicting the suffering and daily life in Nazi concentration camps in her paintings. After being deported to Auschwitz, Rosenfarb managed to survive, and after the war ended, she moved to Canada. She is recognized as one of the most important Yiddish novelists of the post-war period. She survived the terrible conditions of the Lodz ghetto and was later sent to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. In 1945, she was liberated by the British Army on the verge of dying from typhus. Her best-known work centers on her experience in the Lodz ghetto during World War II. In this work, she deeply analyzes the human condition amidst suffering and oppression, exploring the origins of anti-Semitic hatred, the loss of identity, and reflecting on humanity. Another Polish artist who survived the Holocaust was Rachel Auerbach. A writer, historian, activist, and poet, she used her talent to document and expose the war crimes committed by the Nazis during World War II. Following the Nazi occupation of Poland, Auerbach organized a soup kitchen in the ghetto, helping to feed Jews living in extreme poverty. She joined the underground Oyneg Shabbes movement, dedicated to documenting ghetto life and the events taking place there. Rachel kept a Polish-language diary where she expressed her anguish over the fate of Jewry in Warsaw and wrote a monograph on ghetto hunger. Although she escaped the Great Deportation of 1942, Auerbach collected testimonies from Jews who escaped from Treblinka, preserving the historical memory of her people. In 1943, Rachel managed to escape to the Aryan side of Warsaw, becoming a messenger for the Jewish resistance and collaborating with activists to recount the Jewish experience under the Nazi regime. She was one of the few survivors of the Oyneg Shabbes resistance group and managed to rescue sensitive information from the ghetto archives, helping to document wartime events. In many camps, art emerged in the silence. Women scribbled with cooking charcoal on the inside of walls, drew on the back of torn uniforms, or sewed fragments of songs into the hems of their dresses. Their tools were rudimentary: toothpicks, bent nails, human hair. They used the empty envelopes of unmailed letters, torn medical labels, or scraps of weathered cloth as supports for words and drawings. Some buried notebooks in grease-sealed tin cans, others hid them among loose bricks or inside makeshift pillows. Materials circulated clandestinely. Dental floss served as a needle to embroider verses on handkerchiefs. Chimney soot mixed with saliva served as ink for sketches depicting life before confinement. Even in the midst of extermination, some transcribed entire songs from memory or composed short plays that were recited in low voices from memory by fellow inmates. One of the most common forms of cultural resistance was the creation of visual images that didn't have words. Portraits of eyes, outstretched hands, open windows. They weren't just decorative, they were code. A drawing could represent a location, a message, a warning. What looked like art could also be information. These fragments weren't seeking recognition. They were traces, evidence that even their memory was written on every possible surface. resisting with every stroke the oblivion imposed by Nazi silence. Another woman instrumental in saving the history that the Nazis tried to erase was Dita Krausova, a survivor of the Theresienstadt ghetto. Dita is world-renowned for her courage in organizing a clandestine library at the Auschwitz concentration camp, where books, writings, and essays banned by the Nazis were shared. Together with Freddie Hirsch, a Jewish man who organized a school for children inside the camp, they managed to create this clandestine library consisting of only 8 books and some writings. Dita was in charge of caring for and hiding these books to prevent the Nazis from discovering them. She was transferred to Bergen-Belsen in 1944 and then liberated by the Allied forces in 1945. Krausova was key to preserving culture and knowledge, using literature as a form of resistance. Women, childbirth, and the horror of concentration camps, the story of Stanisława Leszczyńska. One of the most painful and least documented aspects of daily life in the concentration camps was the experience of pregnant women, especially births that occurred in the most inhumane conditions possible. Most pregnant women were sentenced to the gas chambers almost immediately upon arrival, but some managed to escape this fate and give birth in the camps. It is important to note that the Nazis showed no mercy to anyone, least of all pregnant women. Guards were ordered to send any woman showing signs of pregnancy to the gas chamber. This was because the Nazis considered Jewish newborns to be unproductive and a burden on the camp system and organization. For this reason, it was very common for the Nazis to kill babies at birth or starve them to death, denying Jewish mothers the ability to breastfeed. Faced with this situation, pregnant women imprisoned in concentration camps faced the heartbreaking decision of hiding their condition or risking certain death for both themselves and others. In the final months of pregnancy, many prisoners used worn blankets to wrap their torsos and simulate a flat abdomen. Some applied mud or ash to their faces to appear sicker and avoid examinations. Others walked hunched over and ate less to reduce the visible size of their bellies. Everything was improvised. There were no protocols, only fear and creativity. In the barracks, the other women became silent allies. They formed human walls to hide pregnant women during the head count, or gave them their only ration of soup to strengthen them before delivery. Births took place on the ground covered with kindling, dirt, and straw scraps. There was no light, no clean water, and no protection. In the darkness, one companion held the mother's hand while another covered the baby's mouth at birth to prevent it from crying. If the crying was too loud, they could be discovered. Often the first thing that touched the newborn's skin was a torn sheet or a gown stolen from the camp laundry. Some women tore the umbilical cords with their teeth. Others used rusty nails or broken glass previously boiled in a metal container over a makeshift flame. In the minutes following birth, the women tried to keep the baby in absolute silence. They wrapped it in hidden clothes or reused wool blankets and concealed it under floorboards or between mattresses only for hours. Occasionally, the newborn was handed to another prisoner with no biological ties to throw the guards off the scent. It was an improvised chain of care that lasted only until the first cry, the first movement. Often, the babies didn't survive more than a day. When the situation became unbearable, some mothers buried their children secretly, using bent spoons or their own hands. They chose dark corners of the barracks or the outskirts of the camp. Others, faced with the inevitable, handed the baby over to a guard in the hope that it would be sent to a Nazi orphanage, which rarely happened. Most newborns were executed or abandoned on direct orders. Despite everything, there were women who repeated the process more than once. Some became pregnant knowing it would be their doom, but they did so by choice, as a form of biological resistance. In the midst of extermination, giving life was, for them, a way of not disappearing. For their children. Hiding their pregnancies and daring to give birth in the barracks also posed an extreme risk, as they suffered from severe malnutrition, exhaustion, and unsanitary conditions. Giving birth in such circumstances also entailed a risk of death for both mother and child. However, many women decided to take the risk and hide their pregnancies in the hope of surviving and seeing their children born, even when the odds were against them. It is in this context that the figure of Stanisława Leszczyńska emerges, becoming a heroine for many pregnant prisoners. Stanisława was born in Poland in 1896 and, before being arrested by the Nazi regime, worked as a midwife in the Łódź hospital. After the German invasion of Poland, she was sent to Auschwitz with her daughter, where she was assigned to the camp's maternity ward known as the Revier, a section where pregnant and sick women were held. Stanisława not only practiced her profession with absolute professionalism despite the appalling hygiene and sanitation conditions, but she also refused to follow the orders of Nazi doctors who expected her to assist in the death of newborn babies. Leszczyńska steadfastly refused to kill newborns, and even without proper instruments or clean water, she used her midwifery skills to deliver more than 3,000 babies inside the Auschwitz concentration camp. Stanisława not only risked her life by disobeying Nazi doctors' orders, but she also tried until the last minute to keep her babies alive. After the war, Leszczyńska returned to Poland, where she continued working as a midwife. It wasn't until 1957 that she dared to publish her account of her experiences at Auschwitz, recounting the hell she endured and capturing her heroic story. Women collaborators, the Kapo prisoners. In the concentration camps, the horror was inflicted not only by the Nazis, but also by some prisoners. In concentration camps like Ravensbrück and Majdanek, select groups of prisoners actively collaborated in the subjugation of Jews. This group was known as kapos, women chosen by the Nazis to maintain order within the barracks or supervise forced labor. Although they too suffered the inhumane conditions of the camps, many used their positions of power to torture and abuse other prisoners, revealing human cruelty at its finest. Despite the brutal environment, some kapos maintained routines that partially removed them from the general suffering. They were assigned separate bunks with clean blankets or less worn clothing. Some had a pocket mirror, German soap, or even a personal porcelain cup, objects unthinkable for the rest. While the prisoners received watery soup in rusty cans, some kapos were given more elaborate portions of food, with chunks of meat or mold-free bread. They had permission to enter certain restricted areas, such as kitchens, offices, or storage rooms, which gave them access to goods to trade or exchange favors. Some even stored personal belongings seized from other inmates, hidden rings, pieces of cloth of emotional value, or family photographs. These objects were used as silent currencies of power. After a day's surveillance, many kapos returned to spaces where they could sit, smoke confiscated cigarettes, or write on small pieces of paper without supervision. In some camps, there are records of kapos keeping notebooks where they recorded names, punishments, or rumors, something they used to blackmail or control other inmates. Their free time, although limited, was a privilege. Some listened to music on confiscated radios or engaged in conversations with Nazi officials who offered them benefits in exchange for sexual favors or information. These connections were not always voluntary, but they gave them access to resources such as shelter, better shoes, or protection from rival kapos. This level of personal gain, built on the suffering of others, led many kapos to develop a lifestyle alien to that of others. While hundreds of women rotted in misery, they maintained a fragile superiority forged by betrayal and utility. This daily contrast, eating better, sleeping more, having soap, was another form of psychological punishment for those who observed them. One of them was Hermine Braunsteiner, who was eventually in charge of selecting women for forced labor and even for medical experiments. She was known as the Mayor of Majdanek due to her sadistic practices in punishing prisoners. She would beat women with her boots when they fell from exhaustion from work and would not stop until she seriously injured them. Near the end of the war, Braunsteiner managed to escape from the Red Army in May 1945 and went into hiding in Austria. She was arrested by the Austrian police and handed over to the British military. She served 3 years in an Austrian prison and, upon her release, married American Russell Ryan. Through this marriage, Hermine obtained American citizenship, and the couple settled in Maspeth, New York, in the early 1960s. In 1964, Braunsteiner was discovered by Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal, who reported her case to the authorities. In 1968, her American citizenship was revoked for failing to pay for her war crimes, and she was extradited to stand trial in Germany. Thus, Braunsteiner became the first war criminal to be extradited from the United States to Germany. After several trials, on January 30th, 1981, Hermine was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of 80 people, for inciting the murder of 102 children, and for aiding and abetting the deaths of 1,000 people. Another of Ravensbrück's most notorious capos was Erika Bergman, known for her extreme cruelty, leading both guards and prisoners to call her the Beast in Human Skin. She earned this nickname for her brutal treatment of the prisoners working in the camps. During her trial, she was accused of using her dog to attack a 20-year-old Roma woman whom Bergman claimed was working too slowly. The severely injured woman was left outdoors for hours under Bergman's orders, who warned that any prisoner who tried to help her would suffer the same fate. She also attacked other prisoners for having hair that was too long or curly, allowing her dog to attack them, resulting in severe injuries, including loss of vision. After the war, Bergman maintained her anonymity until 1955, when she was tried for war crimes in East Germany. After German unification, she applied for parole, which was granted in May 1991. At the time of her release, Bergman was the Nazi war criminal who had served the longest term under East German law. She died in 1996 in Guben, Germany. From heroines to martyrs to collaborators, the stories of women of all kinds emerged from the Nazi concentration camps. Most of the prisoners who were subjected to unspeakable brutality are now part of the memory left by the Holocaust. Their courage, strength, and commitment to survival, even their insubordination, are a perfect reminder that even in the darkest moments, human beings have hope to overcome horror. Today, more than ever, it is crucial that the world continue to remember and learn from these women. Their lives and stories teach us not only about the mistakes of the past, but also about what human beings are capable of when it comes to fighting, resisting, and surviving.